How's it going, everyone? Anthony here, and I have a deck tech video I wanted to do on Yarok the Desecrated. Yarok, this has been one of my favorite commanders, but I never really built a deck around it. I've always wanted to, and with the recent reprinting of this card, I ended up with a few copies of it, so I didn't really have to go out of my way to build this. So that's always nice. Yarok costs 2, a black, a green, and a blue, so costs 5 total, and is a 3/5. Yarok has Death Touch and Lifelink, and if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So we can trigger ETB abilities and Landfall abilities with Yarok, and with these colors we get to really exploit ETBs in a unique way. I had a deck was Rune, and Rune is green, white, blue, so having white definitely helps to capitalize on those ETB effects, and there's a lot of good effects in white, but with having black we can also really take advantage of other effects as well. So this deck is built it's pretty much my Corval deck with all of the Landfall, and there are some cards in here also that synergize with the actual entering the battlefield effects. So it's going to be a lot of Landfall synergy and a decent amount of ETB synergy. You could definitely go strictly Landfall with this and get a lot of value out of it. In one of the games that I played, I really kind of in the early game leaned into the Landfall pretty heavily, and then once I had enough gas, I started to lean into the ETB effects a little bit more to really just close out the game almost immediately. So with Sheoldred, the ETB, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, and by having these doubling effects on the board, it's now sacrifice multiple non-token creatures instead. So that's basically a one-sided board wipe that gets around things like Indestructible. So but what I had noticed is that even though I in the beginning of the game was leaning into the Landfall synergies, it's really easy to deck yourself out. So things like the Jace, Planeswalker, Thassa's Oracle, Lab Maniac, that would be a really good option to include in the deck, and more graveyard synergies, because what was happening is I was drawing lots of cards. I had out I forget the Merfolk, I forget what their name is. Oh, there she is. Tatiova. So I had Tatiova out with all these other doubling effects and lots of Landfall, and so I was quickly drawing lots of cards, and I don't have a lot of stuff in here that increases your maximum hand size, so a lot of stuff was ending up in the graveyard, which is fine because that was triggering Gitrog, which was making me draw more cards. So you could swap out the ETB synergies and lean into the Landfall more with Tatiova out, and lean into draw synergies, graveyard synergies, and aim for winning by self-mill. Self-mill would be extremely easy without even purposefully going in that direction. Just by the amount of Landfall triggers and drawing cards and stuff like that, you can get into the self-mill strategy pretty easily without even have to specifically going for a self-mill strategy. All right, so yeah, that's a lot of fun, definitely. And if you're going to do that, I wouldn't necessarily worry about having no maximum hand size. But if that's not something you want to do, then definitely more cards that will not limit your maximum hand size. Leaning into the draw synergies would be great. And also, I had to copy, and I have no idea where this card went, but I'm kind of blanking on the name right now. Muldrotha. would be great in here to be able to play cards from your graveyard, because I just had so much to choose from my graveyard. So this deck can definitely use a little bit of fine tuning. Again, I kind of took what I had set aside for Yarok and blended it with Korvold, knowing that you're going to get maximum value out of your landfall triggers. So yeah, that's the little bit of overview I wanted to give on the deck. So let's go ahead and take a look at the deck list. Now this would be linked in the description along with the Discord. So you could visit the Moxfield link, check out the deck, check out the mana curve, play test it on there, and yeah, get a sense of like the value and everything, because this is a blend of cards from my Korvold deck. The price is a little bit up there, but if you were to take away the special treatments on the cards and a couple other cards in here, you could build this with a relatively fair, decent budget. So for creatures, we have some ramping creatures. There's a lot of legendaries in here, so Delighted Halfling is great. So it taps for colors, or taps for 1 mana of any color, but it can only be cast spent to cast a legendary spell, but that can't be countered. So this was actually great to get my commander out pretty easily. So that's definitely great. Elves of Deep Shadow taps for black and deals 1 damage to you for 1 green. Birds of Paradise taps for 1 mana of any color, and it has flying. Coiling Oracle, ETB, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it onto the battlefield, otherwise put that card into your hand. So a little bit of ramp, a little bit of, we have both the ETB and Landfall synergy. So this card is actually really, really good if you're deciding to stick with this sort of build where we do exploit a little bit of the ETB synergies since they're just fun. But definitely Landfall seems to be like the most competitive versions to build. Wood Elves comes into play. Search your library for a forest, put it into play. So another ETB Landfall synergy there. Wayward Swordtooth, you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and it can't attack or block unless you have the City's Blessing, which means you control 10 or more permanents. So not bad there. And then Dryad of the Elysian Grove, you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Hand lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. So a little color fixing there. Baleful Strix, ETB, draw a card. It has flying and death touch and only costs 2. Excellent card. I would not take that out. So here are some more of the ETB cards. These are some fun cards. I kind of wanted to play them out and see how well they did in this deck. So there's definitely some cards in here that you can take out and add in for some better cards. This deck is built with just cards that I had in my personal collection. I didn't purchase any additional cards for this. So yeah, just keep in mind, but I am still curious on what cards you would recommend adding to make this deck even better, and what you would take out. There might be some cards here that you see you would be able to take out, but they seemed fun to play. Intellect Devour, when it enters the battlefield, each opponent exiles a card from their hand until it leaves the battlefield. So we can obviously flicker this with certain cards, and just keep sort of messing with our opponent's hand. But you could also play lands and cast spells from among the cards exiled, and you could spend mana as though it were mana of any color. So I kind of like this as we could get this like revolving selection of cards that we could steal from our opponents, stuff that we don't want them to play, and really just kind of mess with their strategies here. And the ability would trigger multiple times as well, so we could exile multiple cards. Hostage Taker, sort of the same idea. ETB, exile another target creature or artifact until it leaves the battlefield. So we can take the One Ring, which turns out to be a very powerful card right now with this meta, and we could target anything else that's on the battlefield, and we can actually cast it for as long as it's exiled. So similar to Intellect Devour, except this only targets 1 permanent that has to be on the battlefield. So it might not even be as good as that card. Gelatinous Cube, ETB, exile, target non-ooze creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. And then you can pay X and a black to put it into its owner's graveyard. So out of the 3, this one's probably the worst. of those three with sort of similar effects objectively. Mind Flayer costs 5 to play. ETB, gain control of target creature for as long as you control Mind Flayer. So we could double up on those abilities, and it's similar, all sort of similar cards, similar effects. Acidic Slime is great because it has Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, we can destroy target artifact, enchantment, or a land. And when this effect doubles or doubles or triples or whatever, when we can get additional effects from this one effect, then yeah, we can destroy multiple lands, multiple enchantments, to choose one of each. Sheoldred is great. So this is the card I was mentioning earlier. ETB, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. With our commander, we could double up on that. So now each opponent has to sacrifice 2 non-token creatures or planeswalkers, and if we could double it again or have it trigger another an additional time off of that, it's really good. And then let's see, you can pay 5, so 4 and a black, exile it, return it back to the battlefield transformed under its own control. You can only do this as a sorcery, and if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, which isn't too difficult to do. And when you flicker it, it enters as the True Scriptures. It is an enchantment saga, and for each opponent, so as it enters, you get to after your draw step, add a lore counter to it. But as it enters, you go right to the first saga. Each opponent destroy up to 1 target creature or opponent creature or planeswalker that player controls. Number 2, each opponent discards 3 cards, then mills 3 cards, and then number 3, put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control. It's very powerful effect. So if you want to lean into like mill, self-mill, that would be great, and you could definitely do that in this deck. Garuda, Doom of Depths, costs 6. It's a 6/6. When it enters battlefield, each player mills 4 cards. Put a creature card with an even mana value from among the mill cards onto the battlefield under your control. So this helps with your self-mill. This ability would trigger additional times, and you also get the selection of what your opponents are playing. So that's cool. Kadama of the East Tree. When another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser CMC from your hand onto the battlefield. I believe this works with lands because lands are permanents. So equal or lesser CMC lands would have 0 CMC, so you get to put just another land onto the battlefield. So it would only trigger that one time, so 1 additional time off of its own ability, but then it synergizes with our commander. So very powerful card. Bane of Progress, ETB, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Put a 1/1 counter on Bane of Progress for each permanent destroyed this way. Better, well, obviously best later in the game. When I was playing, I racked up a whole bunch of clues, so we could sack the clues when we want, and then now we have like, I had something like, man, I mentioned it in the Discord what the outcome of the last game I played was, but it was real crazy. I forget how many clues I had, but it was dozens. So this we could create like a big creature. There's not really much other synergy with this being big, but it's still a big attacker and blocker. If we have Sheoldred out and then we do that one-sided board wipe, and then we basically just with Bane of Progress and Sheoldred wipe most permanents on our opponent's side of the battlefield, and then we could just swing with Bane of Progress directly, that'd probably be the move. Craterhoof Behemoth, ETB, creatures you control gain trample and get XX until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. Scoot Swarm, I had Scoot Swarm out, and there was something like 256,000 Scoot Swarms out in this deck. So that's clearly a game under there, aside from just having 256,000 Scoot Swarms. Bloodghast just synergizes with our Landfall, so these are going to be more of our Landfall synergy creatures. It can't block. It has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life. But whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return Bloodghast from your graveyard to the battlefield. This works best with sacrifice landfall type synergies. So, but we could still, use this to attack or find some other way to gain value from this card, but then bringing it back every single time a land enters. Lotus Cobra. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any color. Course of Crufix, you can play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play lands from the top of your library. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So you gain lots of life off of this. Tireless Provisioner, when a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token. So a treasure token is going to be great for more mana. And I don't know if there's any X spells in this, but if you could find a really nice card, I'd probably add like 1 or 2 cards that we could just dump a bunch of mana into and do something cool with. Like a Torment of Hailfire. That could be a game ender, because with things like Lotus Cobra and all of our landfall, and then the treasure tokens we're gaining, and then doubling on all these things, it's very easy to end up with a ton. You could basically just pull all the lands from your deck very easily and put them onto the battlefield, and then now you're working with, you know, all your lands. And that would be nice to just dump into a Torment of Hailfire, to be honest. So I'd probably consider adding that in this deck list. Scroot Swarm is pretty crazy, pretty busted card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. Now, if you control 6 or more lands, you create a token that's a copy of Scroot Swarm instead. So for every Scroot Swarm, you're going to get another copy of Scroot Swarm whenever a land enters the battlefield, as long as you have 6 or more lands. So this is how you can very quickly end up with 256,000 of these things. It's pretty crazy. A lot of fun to play in Arena and watching it just go burr. Nissa, Resurgent Animist, very similar to Lotus Cobra, except it has an additional effect. If it's the second time that this ability has resolved, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an elf or elemental. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I'm sure there's like some sort of like CDH like synergy with this card. We do have other elves in here, and we do have other elementals in here. So the ability does work for tutoring something up basically every turn, because we're going to have multiple lands entering each turn. So we get to just tutor up whatever elementals we have in here. Azusa, Lost but Seeking, allows us to play 2 additional lands on each of our turns. Ramanap Excavator, you may play lands from your graveyard, which is great. I'm looking for this in landfall decks. Tireless Tracker, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, investigate and create a clue token, which is pay 2, sack it, and draw a card. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on Tireless Tracker. Oracle of Moldiah, you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play lands from the top of your library, similar to other cards in here. Now, Obnixilis is definitely another card that's very important in this deck. It does a lot of work, and this is how I won the last game I played. Very, very easy to win in Landfall deck. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player lose 3 life. If you do, put 3 1/1 counters on Obnixilis. Obnixilis got huge in of itself, but then before I could even attack with Obnixilis, my opponent had lost the game by losing life. Tatiova is definitely an MVP in this deck. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. That'll keep your hand full, plentiful. This could lean into pretty much any other synergy you want, because we're gaining lots of life, we're working with our landfall synergies, and we can go self-mill and win the game. We also have lots of answers in our hand, lots of card draw if you want to work on draw synergies. So super fun. Rampaging Ballast. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. So that's good. Ancient Green Warden, you may play land cards from your graveyard, which is great. And if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Yeah, so we're doubling up on our landfall triggers with this card. So there's a lot of doubling effects and getting as much value as we can with other cards. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, put a 0/1 green plant creature token on the battlefield for each land you control. So right off the bat, we're going to get a Well, we have both our ETB and Landfall, so this card works really, really well. So we can just flicker this and get a bunch of 0/1s, and then when we work with our Landfall triggers, we get to put a 1/1 counter on each plant creature you control, and then all of these things can double a lot. So this card is very powerful with this current build. Gitrog monster, Death Touch at the beginning of your upkeep. Sacrifice the Gitrog monster unless you sacrifice a land. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever one or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you get to draw a card from anywhere. So whenever it's coming in from the deck or our hand or from this ability, you get to draw more cards. So definitely looking to draw synergies. Thassa, Deep Dwelling, cost 4, indestructible, 6/5. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. At the beginning of your end step, exile up to one other target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So you can do Avenger of Zendikar with all the lands that we have, and then we could flicker it at the end and then get even more plants. Traverse the Ulvenwald. So our instants and sorceries here, we have we get to search our library for a basic land, reveal, put it into our hand, shuffle. If there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, instead search your library for a creature or land, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So a 1 mana sorcery that works really well in this deck. We can definitely take advantage of the ramping, but it's very easy to just tutor up a creature for 1 in this. We have Crop Rotation, search for a land. Farseek, search for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain. 3 visits, search for a forest, put it on the battlefield untapped. Growth Spiral, costs 2 instant. Draw a card, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Balaged Recovery, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Obviously works very well. We have a pretty thick graveyard in this deck. For tutors, we have Worldly Tutor, 1 mana instant, search for a creature, shuffle, put it on top of your library. Vampiric Tutor, same effect, except we get to search for any card and we lose 2 life. Demonic Tutor, pay 2 sorcery speed, search your library for a card, put it into your hand. I forget what this card's called because it's in Japanese, but it's like sacrifice a green creature, and then you get to search your library for a another green creature. Or is it sacrifice a creature, search your library for a green creature? But yeah, more tutors. Assassin's Trophy, instant speed, destroy target permanent and opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land. So pretty good removal with these colors, black and green. Abrupt Decay, can't be countered, destroy target non-land permanent, CMC 3 or less. Sultai Charm, we get to destroy a target monocolored creature, artifact, or enchantment, or we get to draw 2 cards and discard a card. Lots and lots of card draw in this deck. I'm wondering what the best card is for drawing synergies. I'm sure there's something good in blue and black. Damnation for our board wipe. And these cards synergize really, really well. Scape Shift, sacrifice any number of lands, search your library for that many land cards, then put them into play tapped. This is going to trigger a lot of landfall stuff. It's also going to trigger Gitrog, which is going to allow us to draw more cards. Drawing more cards can then turn into something else. Also gaining life from all the landfall and all these other things. Splendid Reclamation. This is what won me the game. With all the cards I was drawing, lots of cards are going into the graveyard. I was drawing more cards, which forced more cards to go in the graveyard, which also, like during cleanup with Gitrog and everything, discarding lots of cards was just creating this like self-mill cycle. And then on my next turn, playing Splendid Reclamation, bringing all those lands back to the battlefield. I had every land in my deck on the field that all enters the battlefield, and then that triggering Obnixilis and then winning the game. Reshape the Earth, cost 9. This is a very hefty cost. You get to search for up to 10 lands, put them on the battlefield, tapped, and shuffle your library. So I was saving up to play Reshape the Earth, but I ended up playing Splendid Reclamation instead. And it's a lot cheaper. And it just happened to work a little bit better because of the self-mill. So it actually might be a little bit better than Reshape the Earth. I was able to get a lot more lands for half the cost. It was easier to pull up. For artifacts, we have Soul Ring. Arcane Signet, Sensei's Divining Top, Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, Sword of Hearth and Home, costs 3, equipped creature, gets +2/+2, and has protection from green and white. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then search your library for a basic land, put both cards onto the battlefield under your control, then shuffle. We're getting both our Landfall triggers and our ETB triggers. So we get to search for a land, and we get to flicker a card that has like a nice little ETB trigger. So it's super fun. Crucible of Worlds allows us to play lands from our graveyard. Panharmonicon costs 4, and if an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, triggers an additional time. So just like our commander, except it only works with artifacts or creatures instead of any permanent types. Conjurer's Closet costs 5, and at the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under your control. So double up on our ETBs there. For enchantments, we have Exploration. You may play an additional land on each of your turns for 1. Sylvan Library costs 2. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand, draw on this turn for each of those cards, pay 4 life, or put the card on top of your library. Pretty much just standard, like, commander staple, really good in any deck that has green. It only costs 1 in a green. Tribute to the World Tree. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card if its power is 3 or greater. Otherwise, put 2 1/1 counters on it, and this does synergize with our commander. Defense of the Heart. This is a brand new card that I played with. I only recently acquired this card, and it is a lot of fun. It's, you know, an easy target though for removal. At the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls 3 or more creatures, sacrifice Defense of the Heart. Search your library for up to 2 creature cards and put those cards onto the battlefield. So we get our tutor up 2 for 4. We get to tutor up 2 creatures, and with those ETB abilities, they can enter, and then we can get 2 ETB abilities that trigger additional times. And this would also be good in Corvold in general, because we could do sacrifice this, trigger Corvold, search up our stuff, bring it into the battlefield, and then, you know, see what kind of value we get off of that. So that's it for our spells. For our lands, we have a few basics here. We have 2 swamps, 2 forests. We have, for our fetch lands, Verdant Catacombs, Misty Rainforest. We have Prismatic Vista, Fabled Passage, in which all the fetch lands are really, really good. Playing them from the graveyard, we could tap, sack, and we could play it, trigger Landfall. Tap, sack, search for something, second land entering the battlefield, so trigger Landfall again. If we could play additionals and play from our graveyard, then we can play this from the graveyard, tap, sack it, that's 2 more, and then if we could play 2 additional at the most, then that's tap, sack, another 2 more. So it's, you can get a lot of value out of those fetch lands in here. So same thing with Fabled Passage, Prismatic Vista. We have Yavimaya, Cradled Growth. Each land is a forest in addition to its other land types. Busiju, who endures, just good green card, pay 2, discard it, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control, so we can just pay 1 green at best to discard and get its effect. Crystal Vein, sack it and you get to add 2 colorless, otherwise you get to add 1 colorless. If you tap it. So this is also really good for playing from our graveyard. Field of the Dead enters taps for a colorless, and whenever Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So that's excellent in Landfall. Vesuv enters the battlefield. Tapped as a copy of any land on the battlefield. Wasteland, we get to sack, destroy target non-land basic, or target non-basic land, or tap it for a colorless. Command Deep Beacon, we can tap for colorless, or we could sack it to put our commander into our hand from the command zone. Our commander is definitely worthy of being targeted. And then for our multicolored lands, we have, for black-green, Overgrown Tomb, not Slitherborn Pathway, but the reverse side of that. Undergrowth Stadium, Woodland Cemetery. We have our blue-blacks, Clearwater Pathway, Underground River, Morphic Pool, Watery Grave, Shipwreck Marsh, and then for our blue-greens, we have Breeding Pool, Rejuvenating Springs, Hinterland Harbor, Yavi Mile, Coast, Dream Route, Cascade. Of course, we have Command Tower, Lotus Field. When it enters tapped, when it enters battlefield, sacrifice 2 lands, and then you can tap it to add 3 mana of any one color, and then this works well with Gitrog as well. Reflecting Pool, taps for 1 mana of any type among lands that we control, can produce, and Gemstone Mine, ETB, with 3 mining counters. We could tap to remove a mining counter to add 1 mana of any color. If there are no mining counters on Gemstone Mine, sacrifice it. You can always replay it from our graveyard. And then Zagoth Triome, it's fetchable as a Swamp Force and Island, and it enters the battlefield tapped and taps for either black, green, or blue. And we could also pay 3 to discard it and draw a card, and then probably just play it from our graveyard anyway. So that is Yarok the Desecrated. Let me know what you think. Let me know what cards you would take out, what you would add. If you like the video, like, share, subscribe, of course. And Decklist is in the description. Discord link is in the description. And if you have any commander recommendations, let me know in the comments. I'm looking to see, sort of like what decks I could build based on your recommendations using cards that I already had in my collection. So it kind of forces me to be a little bit unique with it. So there are some cards I have that are older, that when thumbing through my cards, I'm like, ooh, let me try this out. Let me see how this works. And sometimes the cards actually work really, really well. And to my surprise, and it sort of forces me to get more creative and branch away from all the staples. Of course, I have the staples as well, but let me know what commander you would recommend I check out, and I'll buy the commander, and then I'll use the cards that I have to see how I can build the deck and how well it works, playing it against some of my more tuned and more competitive decks as a trial, and see if it could withstand going up against Urza or Corvo. So that's sort of my own personal challenge. So if you want to help out and give me some recommendations, I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, until next time, peace.